It really is a pleasure to be here with you this evening. It's very nice to be so far away from home where the heat and humidity is terrible right now in Louisiana. So it is great. I love the countryside here. I got an opportunity to drive around a little bit and looking forward to doing a little bit more of that before I leave town. Let me start by saying this, and just to set this out there, I by no means am a C.S. Lewis scholar. My degree is in New Testament and Greek, and so at our college I teach Greek, grammar, I teach interpretation of various New Testament books, and survey courses. But one of my passions, one of my joys is to read Lewis, and I've studied him for a while. So there's a colleague of mine at the school. We teach a class on Lewis every few years. It's coming up again, and so I'm very grateful for this opportunity to come this week, to hang out, to access some of the materials here. I know I don't have to tell you guys how wonderful of a place this is. I'm sure you come every summer to one of these things, and so I'm glad to be here as a part of this group. I look forward to our discussion and our conversation. As you could say about any one of these gatherings, there's so many things that are here, and even in what LeConte has done, that are important, I think, for us today in our culture. And the subtitle of this book that kind of sets it out is how these two individuals, Lewis and Tolkien, rediscovered faith, friendship, and heroism, even in light of the atrocities that happened in the Great War. And so I think those three things, come to the fore. Hopefully they will as we walk through this together. Now, what I've provided for you is what I felt like were the highlights from each chapter. If you notice as you peruse that, there are, each of the chapters are either the title of one of the two individuals' works, or a line from the opening of a book, or something to that effect. And I'll try to explain why he labels each chapter that way. But one of the things, I'll start by saying this, and we'll jump into how he sets the book up. One of the things I appreciate about what he's doing here, he says that, in 2014, the centennial of the war, there was a lot of rebirth of literature and publications taking place, but none really focusing on the aspect of faith. And so what he does is he traces, some of the key events that happened in the war and how those impact the faith background of both Lewis and Tolkien, and then how we can now today see that evidenced in their writings. And so I appreciate the fact that he is going back to this important setting for the development of really a lot of their thought and their fantasy and those sorts of things. And so those are going to be some of the things that we explore together here tonight. And I'll also say, this is brand new to me. So I want to offer you this option. I know that discussion may typically happen at the end. If there's anything that piques your interest or you have an immediate question about, just throw it out there. We can discuss along the way. I have some specific things that we'll look at together if we don't get to it in the course of the presentation. But if anything comes up, please let's just have an ongoing dialogue as well. So the way that he sets the book up, I've already mentioned the fact that the war had been covered really from every other vantage point except for faith. And so his job, I think, is he sets out to take us on that journey of how these war experiences not only affected them negatively, in the sense that they could never forget some of the things that they had seen or been a part of, but also how it led to many positive things that we see not only in their relationships, but also in the course of their literature. So here's what I found as his thesis for this book. He says, what is needed, however, is a fresh appraisal of the spiritual calamity of the war and the human condition in light of this experience. And I would say that both men address this aspect in their writings by appealing to the fall of man and other biblical storylines that we see throughout Scripture. But this is one I feel that LeConte goes back to. This is where the problem arose. And so if you're thinking about, just to throw something out there with the war, of how the view that technology was going to once and for all kind of deliver us from having to fight any wars ever again, and that really wasn't the case. There was a lot of disillusionment and disbelief after the course of the war. This is something that surfaces in their writings as well, and so we'll look at some of those as we move along. He says the lasting impact of these men on their world, and I would say ours as well, is the reintroduction of the Christian vision of hope in a world that is devoid of it. Now, of course, our world today is different than it was back in 1918 and the years following. But I think we might all agree that we are still maybe living in a context with other things, other types of wars, other types of battles maybe that we fight, where we have to deal with this. A world that many times seems devoid of hope, where we can provide a message that brings that very thing. He ends his introduction with this quote from Faramir. in Lord of the Rings. And Faramir says, war must be while we defend our lives against a destroyer who would devour all, but I do not love the bright sword for its sharpness, nor the arrow for its swiftness, nor the warrior for his glory. I love only that which they defend. And one of the things that Scott mentioned is as we walk through this, I find that one of the emphases for this group so far this summer has been, how does this connect to chivalry and some of these, ancient ideals? And so this I felt like was a great quote. It sets that up. We're going to see him address some of those issues as well. And I've got a few other quotes that we can look at along the way. All right, so chapter 1, he dives into the funeral of a great myth. And here he's referring to the myth of progress, evolution, and other ideas. Before the Great War, there was this belief that society was marching forward, and that because of technology and because of victories on other fronts, in the political world, the cultural world, spiritual world, that we were moving away from wars and fighting altogether. There was this belief that with modern technology, minimal cost would be involved. But some, like Tolkien, refused to believe this. He came to resent these technological advances and industrialization. And he felt that it encroached on his love for countryside and nature. And I think we see this evidenced most of all in his description and depiction of the Shire. And was it later on in life, I think he refers to himself as a hobbit. And, the love of all, of good drink and food and the pipe and all these sorts of things, but the countryside and nature. And so the Shire, I think, becomes kind of like an outlet for him, and what we can see there at the beginning of his story. Lewis says this: I care more how humanity lives than how long. Progress for me means increasing the goodness and happiness of individual lives. For the species, as for each man, mere longevity seems to me a contemptible idea. And that's something we'll get to again later. This idea that even if technology can produce a lengthy life, what about the quality of life? And so we're going to see that develop as well. I think both authors attack this view of progress, this myth of progress in their writings after primarily experiencing the war, that industrialization is a natural threat, or a threat to the natural world, and this is God's handiwork. And so this threat must be reckoned with. And so he states this in his book. He says, in the climactic battles for Narnia and Middle-earth, nature herself joins in the war against tyranny. All right? And so if you think about in Tolkien, the Ents and their march, how they come to the aid of the rest of those there. And then in Lewis, just the animals in general in Narnia, how they're involved in this fight. So all of nature. And I would say, even in Prince Caspian, when the trees are awakened by Aslan and they come to the aid of the Narnians there towards the end of the book. And so we see nature turning back on humanity in a sense. And I think this goes back to that context of the Great War and the things leading up to the technological advances. But not just nature. There's this argument that he makes that even the smallest of animals or people can display the greatest of virtues and of honor. And so one example I find from Lewis is Reepicheep, all right, and just how he's depicted in the story, and then of course the hobbits in Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. Yeah, as he moves along the storyline here, he talks about Herbert Spencer, who is a British social theorist, and he really helped to popularize this myth of progress, beginning with Darwin. And LeConte says the myth of progress was not just one story among many. It was the story, the meta-narrative of all the stories about our mortal lives, a comprehensive explanation of the meaning of human existence. And so I think he was a really big force in making this myth, or helping it to achieve, this sense of popularity in culture. And so that's something that fits. So under that, he mentions eugenics, this idea of fitting people for their work, right? Good gene. And he says here this he applies this to the scientific methods to improve the species, eugenics, and then also the non-human races in their writings. You think about both Tolkien and Lewis. Non-human races are involved in the activities that take place in the worlds that they've created. They felt that this movement, eugenics, was an assault on human dignity. I think we see this struggle come to play in their works with virtue and corruption, and how even those who maybe are portrayed initially with virtuous behavior can sometimes compromise, and it can lead to a corruption in their own character and then maybe the situation. LeConte says that these two men, Lewis and Tolkien, they begin their intellectual careers at this point, at the decline of Christian belief in the world, but also the rise and peak of this eugenics and myth of progress. And so it's almost like if you're standing on the outside looking in, an endeavor destined to fail based on what's happening in society. But I mean, just look at all of us gathered here. I mean, I don't think we can say that was a failure. I know we're talking primarily about Lewis, but he mentions Tolkien, a good bit here in his book as well. And so it seemed that all the odds were stacked against them as they were developing their intellectual careers coming out of the war. But this, again, I think is the beauty and the wonder of what we encounter in their works. LeConte, once again reiterates the idea that the biblical fall was confirmed by their experience of war, that would supply the moral architecture for many of their stories. So if you think about any individual character, many of their characters are flawed, they're capable of evil, and they're in need of divine grace to overcome whatever situation it is that they are a part of. By the time you get to the end of this chapter, you see LeConte really kind of painting the picture here in general of how this is what was going on in society, and here's how it maybe negatively and also positively impacted both men. Now, as you move into the second chapter, the last battle, the 30 Years' War comes up there at the beginning, early in the 17th century. He says that the treaty that ended this war, it was thought would set a new precedent for what was happening in the West, a new political foundation. They sought to remove religion as a source of political strife. And it says they established here the right of non-interference in internal or religious affairs. And so many thought this treaty to end this war, 30 Years' War, would bring about the end, really, of religiously motivated wars. But by the time the Great War comes along, listen to some of the things that we encounter here. And so one statement he has here is of a bishop in London. He says this, and this is not unusual among the clergy of Great Britain. Here's the quote. This bishop says, "I think the church can best help the nation, first of all, by making it realize that it is engaged in holy war, and not be afraid of saying so. Christ died on Good Friday for freedom, honor, and chivalry, and our boys are dying for the same things." And then in all caps, "mobilize the nation for a holy war." And so, so many decades later, we find the same statement being made. This did not end this approach to war. If anything, it is still alive and well. So in England, Christianity and the love of England, duty and honor to king and country, were the emphasis. This was reinforced in England's public school system. Has everyone in here read The Abolition of Man by C.S. Lewis? There were many times in the course of reading this book that, although I don't remember him explicitly quoting it or referring to it, the context of that book by Lewis came to mind. And this is one of those. And this is well before he wrote this, but I feel that Lewis is reflecting maybe even on this time period in his life as well. So I'll make a little plug for Abolition of Man there. Both men enlisted in the British Army, as I'm sure you all well know. And England going into this war, going into the Great War, LeConte says they really felt like they were defending the ideals of Western civilization. Again, keep in mind the myth of progress and how that has carried into this as well. They moved to a culture of alliance of church and state, a form of Christian nationalism. And then he makes this comment that even America viewed the war in apocalyptic and religious terms. And I began reflecting on the New Testament side of it. There were many, and he mentions, I think, Germany here as well. Germany took the idea even further. Some of the scholarship in New Testament studies at the beginning, the first 25 years or so of the 20th century, reflects this same idea as well. Whether it's Jesus or Paul, presenting, casting each of them under the guise of an apocalyptic type messenger. And so there's various books by scholars there during this time, not only American, but certainly German, who are writing on this very idea. And so you see that work itself into academics as well, even in religious circles. One thing that maybe just to confess my ignorance, that I was unaware of here, he talks about the Allies and this demonization campaign. So the quote, I probably have this on the sheet there, it says, "To the Allies, all of this symbolized a German assault on the values of Western civilization." And then he talks about Billy Sunday, okay, the evangelist Billy Sunday, and the statement that he makes. This is what I was unaware of. I hadn't heard of this. That maybe is kind of a... All right, let's see. It says he spoke for clerics on both sides of the Atlantic when he said, quote, "If you turn hell upside down, you'll find 'Made in Germany' stamped on the bottom." Anyone else heard that before? That had not come before me. But that seemed to be a statement indicative maybe of the thought behind this, maybe on both sides of the continent. Now, Billy Sunday was a pretty extravagant individual. It makes sense that he might have said something like that. Maybe other people thinking it and just didn't put it in those terms. Okay, so many also thought that this war would end all wars, bring about the dawn of a new world for both Christianity and democracy. And he asked this question in the book. He says, did this experience of war transform Tolkien and Lewis into faith-based crusaders? He talked about their willingness, to be involved in duty and honor, but I think even Lewis was very, reluctant to enlist and to go into battle. But he says they declined to sanctify war as a divine undertaking. Rather, their characters in their works often display great ambivalence toward conflict. And that'll be something that we get to a little bit later. He does mention, I think a little bit later in the book, about how when the characters fight, they do so primarily because there's a gathering storm of evil. There's something that demands someone to stand up and to fight at that point. Now, in the next chapter, entitled "In a Hole in the Ground There Lived a Hobbit," I'm sure you can tell where that's from, he traces, and I've just got a little bit here, not as much as I have on the chapter on Lewis, which is next, on the background of Tolkien and him enlisting and where he was in the war and those sorts of things. But I'll just hit some of the highlights. So in 1911, he mentions the beginnings of the TCBS, Tea Club, and Barovian Society, where they highlighted the importance of friendship, literature, and the desire to leave a mark on the world, which again, I think is kind of setting the stage for the Inklings later on, Coal-Biters and other groups like that. There's a quote I want to read to you here. One of the subsections here is entitled "Leaving the Lonely Isle." And I found it very striking. As Tolkien is on the boats heading across the channel, he turns around and is viewing his island. And this is what he writes. He says, "Down the great wastes and in gloom apart, I long for thee in thy fair citadel, where echoing through the lighted elms at eve, in a high inland tower there peals a bell. O lonely sparkling isle, farewell." Not knowing if he was going to see his island, as he's traveling to the front. And he connects in here for us some of the scenes that we see when Frodo leaves the Shire. Other characters like that. There's the statement there in Lord of the Rings, "This would mean exile, a flight from danger to danger, drawing it after me. And I suppose I must go alone, but I feel very small and very uprooted and, desperate. The enemy is so strong and terrible." And it seems as if that's something he's thinking as he's on the boat, leaving his home. And so he traces the beginnings of that, the desire for making a mark on the world, the importance of friendship in his life, and later we'll see for Lewis's as well. But this is the chapter where he really gets into trench warfare. And just a few things here. He talks about the conditions of how it was so cold, wet, rat-infested, obviously water and mud, lice, roaches, and then on top of that, the stench of everything. On one occasion, he writes about how soldiers were perching on top of, just a pile of dead bodies so that they can get a good shot in. And so he really traces and tries to set the context, at least minimally, for our understanding of how terrible how atrocious trench warfare really was. And then connects it to some of the battle scenes there in Lord of the Rings. The Battle of the Somme, July 1st, 1916, the deadliest day in British military history. I don't have the number here, but I think it's 1.2-ish million, died in that battle. And detailing both the heroism but also the horror of war and how it was on full display. And Tolkien acknowledges later on that his taste for fantasy was quickened to full life by war. Some of the descriptions of trench warfare seem to connect to Tolkien's depiction of the dead marshes, the dead faces in the water, and the approach to the gate there as you read through that, and the Mordor in general. However, he also makes a statement that this wasn't all negative for Tolkien. As much negative that came out of that in his thinking. He describes the British Expeditionary Force as citizen soldiers, ordinary soldiers steadfast in their duties while suffering in that dreary hole in the ground, the trench. And he makes a statement in here in the book about how this, maybe this played a part in the later in Tolkien's life when he scribbles down on the piece of paper that opening line to the book. In a hole in the ground, there lived a hobbit. He says, I did not know, and I do not know why I wrote this. Names always generate a story in my mind. Eventually, I thought I'd better find out what hobbits were like. I think he does, but that was at least the beginning of it. So even the citizen soldiers in the British Expeditionary Force, I think for him, are those who are the small people, the ordinary people, who are out there doing their job, having a high sense of duty and honor and calling. Let me stop. I know it's warm, but you're being very attentive, and I appreciate that. At this point, do you have any questions about anything that I've discussed before we keep on moving, or do you need to get up and walk around? Everybody's okay? All right, we'll keep going. In the next chapter, The Lion, the Witch, and the War. So detailing influences on Lewis both before and during the war, and where he was spiritually at the end of the war. So he begins reading Homer's Iliad just after the war had begun. And then Langford says that although there is a notion that some British officers went into battle with the Iliad in their backpacks and the rage of Achilles in their hearts, Lewis was not one of them. In fact, he makes the point as you read throughout Homer that suffering and horror outweighs battle glory. And really, you get to the end, it's very fatalistic. Death is the end. No hope is offered. So, excuse me, Lewis begins reading that story. But what I found to be maybe more of an influence for his life, where he says that in March 1916, at a train station and a bookshop, he buys George MacDonald's Fantasies, and it becomes a major influence on his life and thought, probably for the rest of his life. Here's what Lewis says about it. And this, I believe, is in a preface to a reprint of Fantasies. He says, what it actually did to me was to convert, even to baptize, that was where the death came in, my imagination. Now, here's what he means by this, because I don't have that on your sheet. What does it mean to have one's imagination converted or baptized by a work of fantasy? Here he says it rescued his imaginative cast of mind from its dark tendencies, made darker perhaps by the onset of war, and introduced him to what he calls a bright shadow, a voice or force that drew him out of himself. It set before him a vision of a world that must have seemed wholly unlike his own, pure and radiant, yet morally severe. And then there's a quote he takes from, I think it's an article or an essay by MacDonald, and he says this: the best thing you can do for your fellow, next to rousing his conscience, is not to give him things to think about, but to wake things up that are in him, or say, to make him think things for himself. And he goes on to say that this is exactly what MacDonald's work did for Lewis. It woke something up. It woke this beast up within him. During the war, Lewis was generally skeptical on matters of faith. I think because of how terrible the conditions were, He understandably had a sense of fatalism. Lewis later on says that the war produced at least one benefit. It forced us to consider our own mortality. Now, behind the scenes here a little bit, he goes back and discusses the influence of William Kirkpatrick, his Oxford tutor. And he says that under him, under Kirkpatrick, that Lewis's atheism deepened. He says, from Kirkpatrick, Lewis learned that unexamined beliefs and assumptions must be taken to the woodshed. That his ruthless rationality pushed Lewis to embrace logic and reason as necessary, and that Lewis says this, that Christianity is one mythology among many and as false as all the others. Basically, that all religions, all mythologies are man's invention. Now, I don't think it's in this chapter, but a little bit later, he will come to the conversation that Lewis and Tolkien had about myth becoming fact. He doesn't address that here, but he will get into it. And that the war specifically made it very difficult for Lewis to reconcile this idea of the problem of evil, of a loving God and the existence of all this evil, that he said it really made a futile pursuit for him. He ends up on the front lines when he's 19. Alistair McGrath says this, the slaughter of the war sharpened Lewis's doubts about God. I'm sorry, that's LeConte. McGrath says his poetry of the period rails against the silent, uncaring heaven. And so this is the journey that he's on, going into the war. He's reading the Iliad, he encounters fantasies, and then he's experiencing all this stuff. And to me, it's a melting pot of all sorts of cultures and literary backgrounds. And all of this is, I think, floating around in his head. But one thing he knows for sure, he's still in his atheism. He still is going to have a hard time reconciling the idea that God loves people, but there's also evil. Then comes along, at least in the story of how LeConte presents it to us, of a guy named Lawrence Johnson, who was a friend of Lewis's from Oxford, who also fought in the war and then died. He said that often when they were fighting together, they would dialogue about religious things. And that at that time, Johnson, according to Lewis, was moving towards theism. Johnson possessed an unimpeachable integrity, a coherent moral code that caught Lewis completely off guard, and Lewis described him as a man of conscience. And I think he found his life and moral code compelling, so much so that it did come to impact his own journey to Christianity. This, again, being, I think, one of the facets of the book of how LeConte, time and time again, will focus on these various friendships, even if they're only for a few years, and how these friendships along the way awaken spiritual things, not only in Lewis, but also in Tolkien as well. But Lawrence Johnson is one of those for Lewis. This chapter ends with him talking about Lewis basically the same way he did with the chapter on Tolkien. The war had negative effects, but it also had positive effects as well. And he describes this experience that when Lewis was injured, of him taking a train to London to a hospital and just taking in the scenery around him there on the countryside. And so, if I could, I'll read you his summary here. He said it created for Lewis a powerful experience of joy, perhaps something like we might see in Narnia. And here's what Lewis says. Can you imagine how I enjoyed my journey to London? First of all, the sight and smell of the sea that I have missed for so many long and weary months, and then the beautiful green country seen from the train. I think I never enjoyed anything so much as that scenery. All the white in the hedges and the fields so full of buttercups that in the distance they seem to be of solid gold. And he says this, this is Lewis. Lewis says, you see, the conviction is gaining ground on me that after all, spirit does exist. I fancy that there is something right outside time and place which did not create matter, as the Christians say, but is matter's great enemy. And that beauty is the call of the Spirit in that something to the Spirit in us. You see how frankly I admit that my views have changed. And this, I think, it does go back to where he began the chapter on George MacDonald's fantasies. All right, how about this? If y'all are okay, I'm going to walk through the next chapter.
How long have you been in
Um,
When did he go in 1916?
1916, I believe, and let me check the date on the other. April 15th. Let's see. They were bombing the village. April 8th. I didn't go back far enough. 1917. 1917. Mm-hmm. Yeah, 1917.
Was he in contact with Tolkien during this time?
No. No. Yeah, he's still going on chronology. So 1917, yeah.
I
Yes.
found it interesting. A while back you said something about how the war just enraged Lewis towards heaven, so to speak, that it was just distant and cold. And it flashed back to me, my absolute favorite moment in The Lord of the Rings. And I can't even remember if it's Frodo or Sam, but they're sleeping in Mordor, and they've whichever one it was has come to the end of his rope, and he's just done. And you know how Mordor is covered with all this, evil steam and smoke and everything. And for 1 second, you remember this in the
Yeah.
book, the clouds part, and he sees a star through it all, and he realizes that it doesn't matter.
Right.
That
Right.
is so powerful to me.
Yeah.
And Jackson's movie was great, but it really missed that.
Yeah. Right.
It doesn't matter if whatever the outcome is, because there's beauties so far and so big beyond what we're so caught up in this moment.
Right.
We're caught up in something that's noble and everything else, but it's not about our nobility. It isn't even about our success.
Mm-hmm.
It's about, I would say the will of God, even though he doesn't go there, but there's God is even over all of this, and it's not explainable and everything, but, and then at the beautiful moment, and for the first time in a long time, he sleeps that night.
Right.
I just, that's my favorite moment in that, and it kind of,
Yeah.
to me,
Yeah.
really contrasts what you said.
Yeah.
Lewis could almost visualize that head, that star up there, but he kind of raged against it because he didn't understand, he didn't get the innuendo that that star renders, this thing somewhat unmovable.
Yeah.
Because that's an eternal glory.
And like you said, I think that highlights the value of friendship because it's Frodo and Sam together.
Yes, yeah, they're
And you see the
definitely-
friendships in each of these men's lives impact them in so many ways, and especially with the on the angle of faith.
But one of my favorite poets is Leonard Cohen, and he has this song "Captain," and it's the second in command after this incredible battle, and you don't even know what happened. It was just a disaster. And the captain says, "I'm giving you command." You know that, and the guy says, "Command of what? There's nothing left." And he says, "Well, at least show me a decent place to stand." In other words, now how can I capture the nobility of being a soldier in this? And the captain says, "In a massacre, there is no decent place to stand."
Mm-hmm.
And I the thing I love about Tolkien's thing, and again, I'm fascinated with this because it's that whole idea of, and again, I hope maybe we can talk about this later. This idea of how, I wonder how much, any soldier can bring into war nobility, because I've read a lot about war, from the soldier's perspective. And it almost universally, everything I've read, it boils down to that idea that, the cause, the big picture is not the issue. It's like, you're my buddy and we're going to keep each other alive. So I wonder, how does this, because we are talking about the war and faith and everything, so maybe I'm going on and on, I apologize, but maybe those are some things you could also address. How
Yeah,
do they
absolutely.
work those things out concretely rather than just faith-based abstractions? so to
Yeah,
speak?
yeah.
I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, let's do that. I may have something about that at the end. Let's do that for sure. Anything else?
What's your name, sir?
Jeff.
Jeff. My name's Gary.
Hi, Gary.
And I'm reading The Lord of the Rings for the I lost count times. And out of all the quotes, Scott, right? The one you're referring to is when Frodo and Sam, their quest, the success of their quest is in doubt.
Right.
The chances of them returning is not. They don't believe they're ever going to return.
Right.
And this is the quote. There peeping among the cloud rack above a dark tor high up in the mountains, Sam saw a white star twinkle for a while. The beauty of it smote his heart. As he looked up out of the forsaken land, and hope returned to him. For like a shaft clear and cold, the thought pierced him that in the end, the shadow was only a small and passing thing. There was light and high beauty forever.
Yeah, that's it.
So that's the quote.
That's it.
Nice. That's good. Thank you for that. Is this a good time to break? It's 7:42. I say we do it. Everybody's waking up again. So take 5, 6, 7 minutes and we'll come back together. All right, as everybody makes their way back, in the chapter entitled The Land of Shadow, LeConte goes into the scene after the war, and kind of what the world is like. And so he says, for one, the period after the war is characterized by disillusionment, a new cynicism about liberal democracy, capitalism, Christianity, and the achievements of Western civilization. So concepts like decline and collapse, sickness and death, infected nearly every cultural endeavor. And so for these thinkers like Lewis and Tolkien, the notion of humanity's moral and spiritual progress lay in the dustbin of history. And he says also that war launched 3 of the deadliest forces in the history of the West, against which the backdrop formed the crisis of faith: the Spanish influenza, atheistic communism, and fascism. The setting at Oxford was one that he describes as a secular zealots. So these revolutionaries who are seeking to create heaven on earth, and that's also characterized by experimentation and existential doubt. These were the order of the day. So the question, how will the works and these ideas of Lewis and Tolkien ever have influence? Once again, the odds seem stacked against them. Pacifism comes up as something we'll discuss again later. Lewis has an essay on that. But pacifism was all the rage. Lewis at this time was still skeptical of faith in light of his experiences. But of course, if you just read how he may be moving in that direction. Now, after T.S. Eliot was baptized and confirmed into the Church of England in 1927, Virginia Woolf speaks up, and she expresses her indignation really on the part of herself and also her peers in a letter to a friend, and listen to what she says. I've had a most shameful and distressing interview with dear Tom Eliot, who may be called dead to us all from this day forward. He has become an Anglo-Catholic believer in God and immortality and goes to church. I was shocked. A corpse would seem to me more credible than he is. I mean, there's something obscene in a living person sitting by the fire and believing in God. But this seems to be the idea behind those who are looking on Eliot and maybe Tolkien and maybe eventually here Lewis as to the place of faith and Christianity in the world after the war. Next up is the influence of Owen Barfield. So Lewis and Barfield engaged in what they called this great war of intellectual debate. They, when they saw each other, they would speak on some of these religious things. They wrote some letters of correspondence. I was reading earlier, one of the volumes that's here in the center, that we think that each man wrote 12 letters to one another. We have all of Lewis's, all 12, but I think only 2 from Barfield. Although Scott did tell me a little while ago that Barfield's family is looking to try to republish and put some of his writings out there. So maybe we'll get some more information on this. But they engaged in a lively debate and discussion over Barfield's belief in what's called anthroposophy. It's a philosophy founded by the 19th century Rudolf Steiner, and it postulates the existence of an objective, intellectually comprehensible spirit world that humans can access. Basically, mankind is an integral part in creative thought and the evolution of the world. So ideas like karma and reincarnation are key tenets for this approach. LeConte says in 1919 this idea, this way of thinking, was rejected by the Catholic Church. But they engaged in what they called this Great War of Intellectual Debate. Lasted for a few years, but it did influence Lewis. And LeConte mentions at least two avenues here. One, that Barfield persuaded him to abandon chronological snobbery. If you've read any of Lewis, you know he talks about this a good bit. You know, the assumption that the dominant form of thought supersedes anything that we've had in the past, or makes it irrelevant. And so persuaded him to abandon that way of thinking. And then secondly, it challenged him to consider how aesthetic experiences like longing, joy, and even morality could guide us to reality and truth as much as reason could through scientific and materialist arguments. So he says by 1925, Lewis had left the atheism of his younger days. And that Lewis's post-war, once again, friendships prevented him from adopting the moral indifference, what he called the shadow pessimisms, so typical of his generation. Now we come to 1931, the conversation that Lewis and Tolkien have about myth. And so Lewis's primary thought on this was that man creates myths. When Tolkien argues back and says, no, this is God. God's the inventor, the originator of myths. And so you have this idea of myth-making. Mythopoeia, fulfilling God's purposes as the creator. And so they have this conversation about many things, but it comes down to this idea of myth. And so Tolkien proposes the idea, well, what if this story of Jesus the Christ is a myth that just happens to be true? Mm-hmm. And this got Lewis thinking. And this isn't the moment when he, becomes a part of the Church of England or begins that journey of faith, but it had a huge part in his thinking. With both individuals coming from the influence of mythology and Norse mythology and all this, this got Lewis really stimulated here. And I was discussing with a gentleman just a little while ago, the moment that I think Lewis made that coherent decision, it was on the way to the zoo in the motor car. And he writes, and he says, on the way to the zoo, I was not a believer in Jesus as the Messiah, but on the way back I was. And he says there's really no other way to explain it. But we know that this conversation with Tolkien was very influential. Not to mention all the other friendships and relationships we've discussed tonight already. And so Owen Barfield, you got the influence of the conversation with Tolkien, specifically, what if Jesus the Messiah is a myth that happens to be true? And this gets Lewis thinking. And LeConte ends this section by saying that their enduring influence, both Lewis and Tolkien, was not just their mythic imagination, but also their moral imagination. The proposition that every person is caught up in an epic contest between light and darkness. And then the last official chapter of the book, entitled That Hideous Strength, discusses how the war really changed humanity. And so, to sum up here, he says the world was afflicted by both despair and disbelief. You got the idea of literally being in shell shock, insane asylum. Yes, sir.
Something is bothering me about the Great War changed humanity. The Great War is thereby given some sort of existential existence by itself. It was humanity that changed humanity.
I would agree with that. Yeah, we can reword what I put down there. Yeah, you're exactly right. Yeah, you're exactly right. Maybe, yeah. So, not the war itself, but how humans engaged in that war and entered into that conflict.
The experiment they adventured into, yes.
Yeah. And that's where LeConte does talk a good bit about technology and how this belief that technology was going to deliver them from these things, when in fact it actually enslaved.
I'll buy that.
And you see that in, if you think of Tolkien here, the engines of war there, and how these things are created and manipulated and used, for evil purposes. So yeah, you're exactly right. You're exactly right. I do apologize for that. That wording that is confusing. So all these ideas, despair, disbelief, the results of the war, post-war writers, he says, had no mental category for the nature of this kind of conflict. He also states this fact makes the literary aims of Tolkien and Lewis all the more remarkable. They steadfastly rejected the sense of futility and agnosticism that infected so much of the output of their era. One of the things I want us to come back to, I don't know if I have it in this part of the notes there or not, is this idea of escapism in literature. We'll come back to that and discuss that here in a minute. I think the power that we find behind both men and their works is their communication of the Christian vision of the human story. The encounter with the presence of power and of evil. Primarily the corruption of the human heart. And that would speak to what you suggested. This is not just in natural terms, but supernatural. That evil is a corruption of good. And this is the ultimate reality. And this is why I think LeConte goes back to the story of the fall. If the good news of the gospel of Jesus Christ today is good news, it is not just because it remedies something that is bad, although that is supremely important, but it gets back to something that existed before the fall of man, and that is the sense of creation being good. God creating everything in the beginning there in Genesis 1 and 2, and it all being termed as good. And so this idea that evil is a corruption of good, and they say this is the ultimate reality. Again, you find that in the scriptural story, and you see that in their writings as well. We'll come back to the abuse of science and technology. And one of the things that surfaces as well is that it's not just about being involved in the struggle against evil, but persevering in the face of that struggle. Not just mere involvement, but perseverance in that struggle. So, an example, in Prince Caspian, Nickabrick, when he sees that Aslan is not coming when called for help, is willing to compromise with evil. He's desiring help from the White Witch, and this becomes his downfall, his compromise to deal with evil. That even noble motives can become twisted. LeConte says, later the perverse relationship between technology, science, and power became a defining reality of the post-war years. And even Lewis in Screwtape, when he writes, the road to corruption is a gradual one. The safest road to hell is the gradual one. And he's seeing what is transpiring in his own culture. Let's see. Can enable... Both men include the realism of war or battle in their fantasies, although Lewis doesn't necessarily dwell on physical suffering or corpses all that often. He does have aspects of the war even in his children's books. So like Reepicheep and his bodily injuries, Peter's fight with Miraz. These realities provide the matrix for the moral and spiritual development of his characters, Lewis's characters. And they are transformed by the crisis of their own age. So if it's Prince Caspian, the war against the Telmarines, if it's Tolkien, the war for Middle-earth, and they're transformed by not just being involved, but I think their perseverance against that struggle. Okay, and finally, in the conclusion of the book, he does mention Tolkien's idea of the eucatastrophe, the sudden joyous turn when all hope seems to be lost, or the reversal of a catastrophe. So, in Lord of the Rings, when Frodo fails in his quest there on Mount Doom, we see the sudden and gracious turn through who of all characters but Gollum, and how the ring is destroyed. He says in Narnia, you see the death of Aslan on the stone table, but then his coming back to life. Or as it's put in the book, when death itself starts working backwards. And so this idea of a eucatastrophe and seeing what is happening in culture and seeing the redemptive outlook. So this idea of the mingling of grief and joy, how both of these go hand in hand. A price must be paid for joy to come about. And he says this is really one of the themes of mortal or human life. And the same, LeConte says, can be said of the Great War. And the final concept he mentions is the return of the king. No doubt a call to Tolkien's work, but this idea of a great reversal. That both authors were convinced that only one truth could restore and redeem, and that is the return of the king, one who embodies both tenderness and severity. Who I think we really clearly see in Aslan, in Lewis's portrayal of Aslan. He is tender but severe. Like he says, he's not a tame lion. And then he ends the book with a couple of quotes. One from Sam in Lord of the Rings. He asked this question: is everything sad going to come untrue? Revealing of this hope that joy, can be experienced. And then LeConte ends it with this statement. He says, the shadow, capital S, will finally and forever be lifted from the earth. The great war will be won. This king who brings strength and healing in his hands will make everything sad come untrue. Now, there are a few things I have towards the bottom of the handout there. And really just two main items, and then one I wanted to mention. But one, this question of war and Christians. How should Christians think about war? Okay, so and I'm just going to set this up and ask questions, discuss however you want to handle this. But so we know Lewis has written this essay, Why I'm Not a Pacifist. Many of you may have read it. All of you may have read it. And I've given you just the summary there, the 4 factors he brings into the picture about how to look at that. But also, let me mention this, and maybe this can spark some discussion. I have a handful of examples from Prince Caspian of this idea of war and chivalry. If Lewis and Tolkien were drawing on ideals from a former era that had been lost, forgotten, what have you, to really speak to their culture in positive ways, we see some instances of chivalry taking place here in Prince Caspian, and I'm just naming a few. There are probably others that maybe you can think of and we can talk about. I think even the very structure of the 2 primary chapters that discuss Peter's fight in single combat with Miraz, the very structure mirrors the older epics and romance stories. There was the possibility of single combat to eliminate mass slaughter. And so we see that play out. The twin theme here of courage and cowardice comes up a lot in these 2 chapters. So Miraz's counselors encourage him not to fight. But in the end, that's kind of their plan. They want to trick him in to going full on into battle. But he thinks he will be perceived as a coward if he doesn't fight. And so their plan works, and he follows through. Another one. So Peter doesn't want Reepicheep's trumpeter in the procession as he fears it may negatively affect Miraz. Here's what he says. Peter says, and it would not be quite fair to Miraz to have in sight anything that might abate the edge of his courage. The reason he says that is because he says that some humans are afraid of mice. And so Reepicheep responds to Peter and he says, your majesty is the mirror of honor. Maybe something unheard of, maybe especially in the Great War, but you see that ideal of chivalry not wanting to negatively affect Miraz in his person in any way. And then a little bit later, during the actual combat of Peter and Miraz slips or trips, and instead of Peter just taking care of it right then and there, he stands back and he waits for him to gather himself and rise instead of attacking him there. And Edmund remarks, you know what? I don't want to misspeak. I'm going to read you the quote because it ties in with this idea of chivalry. He says, to back up one small paragraph, a great shout arose from the old Narnians. Miraz was down, not struck by Peter, but face downward, having tripped on the tussock. Peter stepped back, waiting for him to rise. And then here's Edmund. He says this to himself, oh, bother, bother, bother. Need he be as gentlemanly as that? I suppose he must. Comes of being a knight and a high king. I suppose it is what Aslan would like. But that brute will be up again in a minute. And then the brute never rose because he's attacked by his own men. And taken care of. But you have that example, and then one more. Aslan and Reepicheep are having a discussion after the fight. Of course, he loses his tail, and he's very concerned about that and his dignity, how he will be perceived. And Aslan says, you're a little too concerned, about your dignity here. But Aslan chooses to restore his tail, but he says it's not because of Reepicheep's dignity, but because of his love for his own people, and then the kindness that he formerly showed to Aslan, that he and his people showed to Aslan when he was on the stone table and chewing the cords. So those are just a few that I've discovered in that handful of chapters there. But and I'll stop there. The primary question you can see there on the sheet, how do we think about war? Pacifism, those ideas, and then what Lewis and Tolkien are trying to do to present chivalry in this context, based on what they're coming from in their own culture. So I'm going to turn it over to y'all. Questions, comments, discussion. It's not an easy topic, I guess, but
Maybe you can, Justin, maybe you can clarify something for me, and maybe based on your knowledge of Lewis and even Tolkien, in that, the idea of chivalry and war, and the importance of heroism in it, and so on and so forth. Just wars, unjust wars. I was in the U.S. Army, and I have some Moldovan friends who were conscripted by the Soviets and served in the Russian Army while I was in the Army. Now, we're good friends. They're Christian brothers and sisters of mine. And I asked the question of one, and he couldn't answer me. And that is, there could have been a time during the Cold War where it might have heated up, where we may have had to face one another. And we were both Christians at a time. I was not a Christian, but it was hypothetical. What if we were?
right.
And I guess there's two questions that you have to ask. One, would we know one another as a Christian? And the other is, if we did, what would our responsibility be?
Did everybody hear the question? I'm going to repeat it for the sake of the camera. The question is, what if two Christians were engaged in a war? How would you go about that? How would you make that decision, whether to fight or to not fight? What do you think?
And let's get real hypothetical. Let's suppose it was a decisive moment in a decisive battle.
Okay.
Like the nail, what is that story? My kingdom for a nail. His horse didn't have a nail and he lost his kingdom. Someone may know. But what if
Right.
one of us has to die for our side and the other one has to kill him
Yeah.
in order to do it? So.
Thoughts? I'm going to turn it over to y'all first. Yes.
I just wanted to say, I think the first part of your question, though, was to talk about the concept of chivalry and the just war. And then came the second part. So I'd love it if you'd address that first part so I could get a clear understanding of chivalry in relation to this gentleman's question.
Oh, yeah. Okay, sure. Yeah, so I think essentially this idea of courage, honor, helping the weak, justice, those sorts of things that we see. And even I think he mentions the Arthurian legends as well. That whole ideal that we see presented, even in the context of battle, which I think we do see in Prince Caspian and maybe other places. So I think, quickly put, that would be my response to that question. And then now we have the easy question in the room.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
If you say so.
I don't think that you would have two Christians about to fight each other to the death in an armed conflict, because before that had happened, they would have had to make a decision what they were going to do with their lives. And so, we've had examples of that during the Vietnam War, where so many men simply refused to fight. They were conscientious objectors, and they simply would not even go into the military. So that scenario of two Christians facing each other, they should have thought that out long before they got to that point. I mean, that was, they couldn't have been living as Christians if they allowed themselves to get that far. because the possibility of killing was right there before them. Why would they allow themselves to get that far, to that point?
Is that a rhetorical question, or would you like me to?
Can you answer?
I can.
Yeah.
If I'm fighting for my country, and perhaps I'm even a medic, who are one of the bravest of the battlefield personnel, and doesn't ordinarily carry a rifle. And there are many Christians who were engaged in World War I, World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. I don't know I'm going to face another Christian. And my it's a two-sided question. One is, we're both engaged in a patriotic struggle for our country. Me, I think it's against evil atheistic communism. His is to protect his motherland. We somehow discovered during a decisive battle that we're Christians. I could very well, as a believer, get into that scenario and defend my country and allow myself to be in the military as a Christian and be patriotic and defend my country, even though I'm a Christian.
But it's almost as if you're saying that as a Christian, it's all right for me to kill a dirty communist, but not another Christian. You know, I mean, if you've come to that point in battle and you're going to kill another Christian, excuse me, where's the Christianity in killing a dirty red commie or a Nazi, or, you know, you're not very Christian if you take that effect. And if you're going to just single out and say, well, I'm not going to touch another Christian, excuse me, you've lost your Christianity somewhere along the line. You know, a Christian would simply say no.
Get a couple other comments. Well,
I seriously think that one thing that comes in play in those situations is when you are face to face, hand to hand, or whatever, or across barricades, or people are coming down to kill you and possibly your family, your culture, you do not say, I want to kill that person. You are, I want to stop that person. And the degree to which you stop is not necessarily your conscious choice. Your conscious choice is, it is my job, or it is my choice, or it is mine. Maybe I wouldn't do it to save my own life, but if there were an elderly person, a disabled person, children, family, I would probably do what I had to do to stop those other people. And if they happen to die in that process, you know, you have to let go of that. I mean, there's potential. Any one of us could kill somebody else quite inadvertently or accidentally, or die at any moment.
I think something that was not considered when you're saying how can you consciously kill somebody or whatever. I went in the military when I was 18. I didn't know anything. I knew very little about Christian life or anything like that. And honestly, it was a place where God had brought me around the world just so that I could come to His salvation. Okay? At that point in time, I had already sworn allegiance to my country. And with that, I don't believe God would have turned around and turned His back on me and said, you can't kill them because you are still in allegiance to where you have sworn to the government. And literally my faith is in Jesus, but I was also contracted and had allegiance to my country as well. And it wasn't on me to say, God, get me out of this, because if He wanted me out of it, He would have taken me out of it.
Scott?
There was a moment in World War I, the first Christmas of World War I, that was a strange and stunning kind of experience. They were in the trenches, Germans on one side, French and English on the other, primarily those two countries. America was not in the war in December of 1914. And on Christmas Eve, both sides of no man's land began singing Christmas carols. And they crawled out of the trenches and went into the middle of no man's land and sang together Christmas carols. It terribly frightened the officers in both armies because the enlisted people were singing and sharing with one another in no man's land, and it required the armies on both sides to enforce their discipline and threaten soldiers to get them back into the trenches. So there was that moment there in World War I when the overarching notion of Christendom, so to speak, had a moment, but it was broken by nationalism and pride and lots of other things that characterized World War
Just wanted to add, my understanding of that moment was eventually the people, the whatever squads, or I don't know the army terms, the leadership broke those groups up because they were extremely reluctant to return to business
Yes.
as usual.
Yes, sir.
There's a movie some years back, I think you could probably still find it. It's called Soldiers and Saints. And it's based on an American that goes to Germany to go to seminary. Befriends another seminarian who's German, and they meet during the war. And it addresses this whole question, and it also brings out the salient point that it depends on who's looking at the circumstance, whether it's chivalry or whether it's cowardice.
Yeah, interesting point. Yeah. What else? Yes, sir.
I'm seeing another side to that point too, thinking about the aspect of, is it right or wrong to kill another Christian versus a non-believer? In one perspective, it's almost the other way.
Yep.
For a Christian, you know where you're going in a sense. It's almost
You know
more.
where he's going.
You kill an unbeliever, you're condemning them. And I think this is. I remember the story. I don't remember what missionary it was. I can't remember who it was, but I think it was some of the lines of. Was threatened by the unbelieving natives that they were going to bring the word to, and they wouldn't defend themselves against them. Because he said, if we kill them, we know where they're going if they don't believe. I know where I'm going if I die. So it almost adds another dimension to this whole question. And I think inevitably it boils down to, I've taught history and looked at the world wars and wrestled these questions with my students, is war is a distortion of everything. It boils down to the brokenness of the world and how everything is wrong. Nothing is the way it should be. And you almost can't make logical sense of anything in history, because my students always ask these questions. It's like there's no logic to it. You have to come back to the fact that this world is broken. And Christianity is the only answer to it. The war was good and there shouldn't have been a war.
I wonder if anyone's willing to entertain the notion that chivalry, nobility, those are kind of almost artificial constructs. I do have a little bit of a problem. I understand Tolkien and Lewis were men of a different time. But like what happened in the trenches at Christmas in 1914 or whenever it was, would that be characterized as chivalry or nobility? Or would that be characterized by something that goes deeper, like compassion and even love? And I return to Leonard Cohen. In a massacre, there is no decent place to stand. I think there's something that I don't want to speak for Leonard Cohen, but the way I receive it is he's challenging some of those traditional concepts that are, and I'm not a pacifist, and the scriptures seem to me, the scriptures are like it's like slavery. You know, they speak out of both sides of their mouths, which is why in the Civil War, both sides could defend biblically. And my interpretation of that is the Bible always deals with the already and not yet. Like Paul says, you know, even if you got a harsh master, serve that well. There's the justification for slavery. But he says in Christ, there is no slave or free. So how many times does Jesus say, to him who has ears, let him hear? And it's like what is said in Christ, there's no slave or free. How can you own your brother? How can you own your sister? But and again, I'm not a historian or anything, but my take on that is Paul wasn't looking for an emancipation movement that would obscure the true emancipation that comes for being in Christ. And I personally see the same thing with war. I'm not a pacifist, but you know, and Jesus says if you're a soldier, be a good soldier. And you know, he doesn't get into that, but I think the implication is be as kind as you can in that context, be fair. But it's so interesting to me. Number one, the early church, from my understanding, was pretty much universally pacifist before the church aligned with, you know, Constantine and the Roman Empire, when they were pretty much whatever. I lost my train of thought. But what Paul's, and this will be the last thing I say, what Paul says is Paul gives a lot of information on warfare. He tells us what our weapons are. They're not carnal. He tells us who our enemy is not. We do not wage war against flesh and blood. And I think, essentially, you know, the Christian spirit ultimately is love your enemies, and that famous bumper sticker, how can you love your enemies and kill them, you know. But yet, I think that's too simplistic, because I love what you said about this broken, difficult world, because, you know, there's the military that goes to defend our country, and the ideals of democracy and all that. Those things are all factored in. But the big question is, how does the kingdom invade, you know, the here and now with eternal things? And I don't have the answer to that, but I guess I like this idea of compassion. I'm just throwing that out. Maybe these ideas of chivalry and nobility are more constructs than are based in real spiritual reality.
And I don't think that either author, Lewis and Tolkien, were saying, hey, if we have to fight again, we need to do it in a chivalrous manner. I think they were fully hoping and expecting this will never happen again, because we've experienced all this. And so yeah, I see what you're saying there, but I do think when you get to the deeper level, if you look at Jesus' ministry, if you look at Paul, if you look at some of the stuff in the Old Testament as well, and how they cared for people, widows and orphans and those groups, that hopefully, and even with slavery, with Paul, at some point, when, and I'll end with this, I know Scott's coming up, when God's people live like God's people, we have compassion, we have love, sacrifice, mercy, I mean, all these wonderful things, then yes, it should end the slavery movement at some point. It should end, hopefully, all these other evils that we see. If we are doing, and I know every situation, just to kind of sum up here, every situation is different, but at the same time, as a believer, these are important issues we have to think through ahead of time. I know you mentioned it's a hypothetical situation, but yeah, like every situation is different. And so it's always going to be hard to come up with a really good answer. But you're right as well. I think those are things that we have to think about. And that's where I think the value in this kind of setting is. So I think it's time. So I think we are going to
First of all, thank you,
finish
Justin.
it up. Yeah.